Thank you. So it's a real pleasure to be here today. I really appreciate it. My first learning from the science of success is don't try to get to Harvard Business School when a Memorial Drive is blocked off by a police barricade. So you might have seen me try and charge in here at the last second. So my name is Gautan Mukunda. I said I'm an assistant professor at the Harvard Business School. And my talk is essentially based, drawn on a book that came out in September called Indispensable, When Leaders Really Matter. And the topic of my talk is something I think that every one of you has thought about and probably discussed at some point in time, quite possibly quite late at night in your dorm room when you were an undergraduate. And so it's some very simple questions. Does who leads an organization matter? Does it really matter who's in charge of your company, your military unit, your university, your country? What does it mean to say that it matters? What do we actually mean when we say that it's important that such and such a person was in charge of an organization or a country or anything else? How do we identify the leaders who actually did have an impact, the ones who are currently having one, and the ones who will make a difference in the future? Is there a way to look forward and see that? And finally, how do we choose the best leaders, and how do we avoid the worst ones? So those are sort of four simple, common questions that are often discussed and that are, I think we'll see, closely related. So the funny thing about leaders is that social scientists and practitioners have a completely different view as to how they matter and how much they matter. Social scientists, not all, but the majority opinion is basically that it doesn't really matter that much who's in charge of your organization. But if you talk to a practitioner, a politician, a soldier, a business person, a journalist, or a historian, what they'll tell you almost universally is you really can't understand what an organization is doing or going to do unless you know what's going on inside the head of the person in charge. So why such a big divide? In fact, I argue that this is actually the single largest divide in the social sciences between the way social scientists view the world and the way everyone else does. How come? So the social scientists, and the striking thing here is this is across fields. This is political science, economics, management, organizational behavior, you name the field. The fields don't really talk to each other, but they've all come to the same three reasons why they think that leaders don't matter. And you might know from my background, I'm a political scientist teaching an organizational behavior unit. So almost all of my research is actually in everything I've ever done, is coming to a field from outside. And the advantage of that is I get to ask questions that people who are inside the field wouldn't ask because they already know the answers. But I don't necessarily, so I get to start fresh. So the social scientists across all of these fields have strikingly come to the same three reasons why they think leaders don't matter that much. The first one is this idea that every organization is externally constrained. Think about a company. If you're a company, you can't set prices at anything you want because you have competitors who will undercut you if you raise them. So you have some limitations on your flexibility there. And then the second force that seems to be really important is this idea that every large organization has internal politics, internal bureaucracy, culture, all of these things that stop leaders from doing whatever it is that they might want to do. So again, limits their discretion. But we can all think of lots of cases where those two forces aren't sufficiently powerful to eliminate the ability of the leader to make choices, right? We can all think of any number of situations where that's true. So it's really the third force that does most of the work. And the third force that you see in the literature is this idea that leaders are not chosen randomly. There's some process you have to go through, and that process is selecting leaders based on kind of what they're really like. And the idea is that it doesn't really matter who ends up in charge of your organization, because if that person, say, decides to retire and spend time with their family or has a heart attack or something, then there's a second person in the organization who they'll just pick as the replacement leader, and that person isn't very different from the first person. And so the outcome will be about the same. So this, I think, actually gets us to an intuitive definition of what we mean when we say that a leader had an impact. Right? And when I sort of pose this, it seems like a definition that everybody kind of agrees with, even though it's not been formally set out. And the idea is it's the marginal difference between what actually happened, right, between what we know happened, and what we can plausibly believe would have happened if the next most likely person had been in charge. So we have to do the counterfactual. We have to think, who else could have been there? And once we found that person, we say, what would they have done? And how different would it have been? And how important are the differences from what actually happened? I think that marginal, that's the difference. That's the compact. So then here's the interesting thing about that. That leads us to an interesting finding about leaders who have, or it's an interesting prediction about leaders who have an impact all by itself. Because that means that the leader who has an impact is the leader who does things that other people who are qualified for the job would not have done in the same situation. So what do we know about decisions that everyone else would not have done the same thing? By the way, I don't, just to be clear, I don't do the lecture and everybody sits there and talks. So if you have a question or a comment, just stick your hand up and shoot, let's go back and forth. I saw you had your hand. Oh, yeah. Oh, okay. What do we know? What do we know about this kind of decision, guys? What do we know about decisions where nobody else would have done the same thing? Anybody? I think we know that these are really high variance. Sometimes they're brilliant. More often they're awful. They're rarely boring. So suppose I told you that your company was just going to hire a CEO, and that CEO had actually been fired previously by your company, in part because he micromanaged a manufacturing project to levels of detail like the color of the paint in the factory to such an extent that the cost overruns became catastrophic. So then, but you're going to hire this person anyways, and they came back, and the first thing they do is they fire the entire board of directors, the one that just hired them, and they replace them with a hand-picked board of directors. This board is chosen specifically to be as compliant as possible with the wishes of the new CEO. And then this new CEO goes to this new hand-picked board of directors and says, I want to get rid of 70% of all of my company's products. You're just going to stop making them tomorrow. And that board of directors, that hand-picked board, says, we cannot possibly support you on this. It's much too radical. It's much too big a change. And because the CEO is a pretty willful person, he goes off and does it anyway. How do you think that story ends? Beg your pardon? Apple. Yeah, that's Apple. That's Steve Jobs at Apple. But if you tell that story and you don't know it's Steve Jobs, most people would say, wow, this is not a good outcome. I want to leave this company, right? That is not a decision process that we like. So high variance, make it great success or great failure. All right, so let me talk you through this theory as to when do you get these kind of high variance leaders. This idea that you could think of organizations as having a pool of people, I call it the candidate pool, who might someday end up in charge. So the organization I always use as a prototype for this discussion is General Electric. Those of you who are familiar with GE know that what it's almost most noted for is its ability to develop and select leaders. We always tell our students at the business school that GE is a company that works in practice but not in theory. Because GE is a diversified conglomerate. What does business strategy tell you to do with diversified conglomerates? You split them up. They can't possibly work. But no one wants to split up GE. And it seems like the secret of GE's success is its ability to train managers and select the best ones consistently over time. So to become the CEO of GE, you can't come in from outside. That's not an option. That has never happened. It will never happen. You've got to work your way up the organization for 20, 25 years. You're being evaluated by your superiors, by your peers, by your subordinates. You're being judged on performance. You're being judged on what people judge to be your capabilities. You're being judged on character. And at the end of the day, there are 5 finalists for the job. 5 people who might be the next CEO of GE, and then one of them gets chosen for the job. And if you believe about all this evaluation stuff, right? If you believe that GE is good at selecting managers, and if they're not good at selecting managers, how have they been so successful for more than 100 years? So if you believe all these things, you should believe 2 things about these 5 finalists, right? The first one is that they're really good at the job. Because if they weren't, how did they get to be one of the 5 finalists to run one of the world's most iconic companies? The second thing is you should believe is that it probably doesn't matter which of the 5 you end up picking. Because how different could they possibly be? They've all spent 25 years moving their way up the ranks at GE. So this is the idea I get to in this idea of a leader filtration process. So when we used to write about choosing leaders, we would say precisely that. We would pick a leader. We would pick a single person who would end up running the organization. And what I thought is actually this language betrays us. This really isn't the right language. Think about the Republican presidential primary in 2012. So Mitt Romney ended up winning. But we didn't pick a winner, right? What we did was we picked a series of losers, right? Person after person got pushed and they dropped out. They got pushed out of the process. They couldn't make it. And over time, what this does, I think, is it makes the pool of potential candidates for leadership more homogeneous. So this is the key idea of what a leader filtration process does. It is the process that determines your next leader of the organization, and every organization has one, right? Of any significant size has one, and it contains both random and non-random elements. Non-random elements are the elements that really matter when you're looking at what this person is going to do once they're in charge of the organization. But no human process is perfect. Every human process has random elements too. Let me give you a classic one. I'm 5'9". I believe with a moral certainty that height has absolutely no relationship to your ability to be a successful manager. But if you are a male CEO of a Fortune 500 company, there is about a 95% chance that you are over 6 feet tall. So this really doesn't make any sense when you think about it, right? Why would you say that people under 6 feet tall are just incapable of managing a large company? Nobody really thinks that's true. But this is how the system seems to work. So height is a perfect random variable, right? And we can all think of lots of others, things that really don't have any impact as to whether how well someone will do. So you can think about this process, because there are these random elements. Even though we only see one winner, you could think of the process as probabilistic. It's a function that produces a distribution, where if we could run the history 1,000,000 times over, what we would see is different people winning as the random elements reshuffle over and over again. So if you could rerun the 2000 American presidential election 1,000,000 times over, George W. Bush would win 300,000 times, and Al Gore would win 300,000 times, and John McCain would win 100,000 times, and somebody none of us have ever heard of would win 3 or 4 times, because all the random elements would shift in his or her favor, and we'd get a fluke, and that person would win. So my argument, essentially, is that if you want to understand when you get a leader who has a high impact, you need to think about this filtration process and think about how it divides the pool of candidates into 2 groups. I call them modals and extremes. I used to call them modals and outliers, then Malcolm Gladwell wrote his book, and I had to change the name. So the modals, right, are the people who are pretty close to the center of that distribution I talked about, the people who are pretty likely to win. And they all have a lot in common, because that's what makes them likely to win. And the second half is the extremes, right? The people who are unlikely to win, who are the outsides of the distribution. And the way you could think about that is these extremes might have nothing in common except for the fact that they're not at the mode, right? Everything else about them is different. So you keep running this process over time, you homogenize the pool, and eventually you end up with a winner. That winner might be a modal, they might be an extreme, and if you want to know if this person is going to have a high impact, what you want to know is which one is it? Which one did we get? So what I'd say is that the way you do this, assess this, is you say, how thoroughly was the person filtered before they came to power? The more thoroughly they were evaluated, the less likely it becomes that they are an extreme. Because in the evaluation process, the fact that they were an extreme would have been caught, and the process would have stopped them from getting to the top, right? So you could think about people who are thoroughly filtered, people who have a long career inside the organization. That's the primary thing right there. And the reason for this is filtration depends on true knowledge. Who here's done a job interview? Who's been on a job interview? Were you completely honest and straightforward during that job interview? Did you tell them everything? No, of course you did, right? It's not even humanly possible to do that. Because when you first meet someone, our natural instinct is to put on our best face, to put our best foot forward. In fact, our research on job interviews shows that they are essentially completely useless in predicting how well someone will do the job. About the only thing they predict is how well the person who does the interview will like the candidate. That's about it. Okay? So true knowledge takes months and years of close personal contact. And even more, we don't just want to know what someone is like, right? Because we want to know what someone will be like after they gain power. Gaining power is a transformative experience on people's personality and character. For most people, it vastly weakens their character. The evidence is that most people who gain power become worse people in the process because of gaining power. It changes who you are. Some people, by the way, don't. There's a small subset of people who actually become better people when they get power. They become more altruistic, but most people actually become more sociopathic as they gain more power in an organization. So we want to know what someone is really like if you're going to trust them to run your company, your scientific apparatus, your military unit, or your country, right? And to do that, we got to know, we have to have that true knowledge. So the only people who really know what a presidential candidate is like, right, are the other political elites. You or I, if we're really, really lucky, maybe we'll meet this person once. What do you know about someone's, when you shake their hand for 30 seconds? It's the people who are in the smoke-filled rooms with them. We want to know what people are like when the cameras are off and the pressure is on. And that takes time. Okay. So unfiltered leaders are the people for whom we do not have that knowledge, who gain power despite the fact that people had not had the chance to evaluate them properly. And those unfiltered leaders are the ones most likely to be extremes. So that's two predictions, right? Our first prediction is that extremes performance will vary more than modals. They will show more variance in their success. And the second one is that they will have a higher impact. They will do things that modals would not have done. All right, so I'm a political scientist by training. So I started this question by thinking about presidents of the United States. What I wanted to know was, how do we test these theories? So historians in the United States have a wonderful tradition where they rank presidents of the United States by order of performance. In the last 60 years, they've done this 13 times, not by coincidence, just about once every 4 years. So these rankings are well validated. They are internally consistent. In fact, they are about 99% consistent from ranking to ranking. And this consistency does not vary based on time, based on how you ask the historians to do the rankings, based on which historians you ask to do the rankings. They basically always come out about the same. If you're curious, the only major change over time is that Dwight Eisenhower shoots up in the rankings after the 1970s. And that largely stems, from what we can tell, from the fact that what happened in the Eisenhower administration was declassified, and suddenly a lot of things that looked lucky actually turned out to be the product of skill. So he looks much better over time. So these rankings are used in the psychological literature to validate ideas about leadership, and so I could use them too. And this was my Christmas present when this article came out like a few weeks before my dissertation defense. There was a publication arguing that there was no statistically significant relationship between pre-presidential careers and position in the rankings. As you will see, I don't think that's true. So our key prediction, right, is that unfiltered presidents who weren't evaluated before taking power, should show more variance in the rankings than filtered presidents. They should be disproportionately at the top and bottom. So what does an unfiltered president look like? Time in filtering positions. That's my I think the most important criteria. Right? What someone does when they are the sheriff of a small town does not tell us anything about what they're going to do when they're president of the United States. Right? But when someone is a member of Congress, a senator, a member of the cabinet, the governor, vice president of the United States, or, we always forget this, flag rank officer in the military, because all of these have to be confirmed by Congress, so they are political positions. They're not just military ones. These are people who you started to move in the circles of the political elite. People have started to get to know you. They've started to be in those smoke-filled rooms with you, and they can start to evaluate what you're really like. So what I said was, let's say 8 years. 8 years is a logical dividing point, right? That's 2 presidential terms. That's 2 governorships in most states. So that's 4 terms in Congress. That's a good sense of time to get a chance for who someone's really like. But because the American political system is weird, there are 3 other criteria we have to look into. Vice presidents of the United States. Vice presidents are often chosen, let's say, idiosyncratically. We have some recent historical examples of that I'm sure are springing to mind. There's one exception to that, is that there are 2 cases in American history of vice presidents who were explicitly chosen as the next president. Everybody knew this person was going to be the next president. So we should think of them as being sort of the ultimate infiltration, right? Because that's the elite saying, without all this messy election stuff, saying, yeah, that person, I want that person to be president. Okay? Next one is a 19th century phenomenon called dark horse candidates, which is something that would happen where basically a political convention would deadlock between the major figures in the party, and you would end up where somebody who really had no idea that there was any possibility they might be president of the United States suddenly got the nomination, and again, sometimes this person would end up winning and end up being in the White House. If any of you have ever seen the Robert Redford movie, The Candidate, where he runs for, I think, I'm trying to remember what the office was, governor, senator? Yeah, he runs for Senate, and then he has no expectation of winning and does, and the last words of the movie are, well, now what? And then finally, there are what I call special characteristics. This is less important in the United States, but it's worth thinking about. Basically, you could think of this as unearned or advantages that were earned, but were earned in a field other than politics, that obscure our ability to make a judgment. So they basically mean someone from a very, very prominent and powerful family, someone with sort of enormous wealth and political connections, that make it more difficult to block them from getting to power, even if they're incapable of doing the job. So if you look at all the presidents of the United States, I didn't bother with William Henry Harrison because he was president for 2 weeks, which, what was the point? And you just list them by how long did they spend in these filtering positions. What you see is a lot of variance, right? You see everywhere from Gerald Ford, 24 years in filtering positions, to Chester Arthur, 1. So that's a lot of variance. And in fact, what this variance does, which is a nice thing, is that it turns out that 8-year cutoff is completely meaningless. You can move the cutoff to 6 years, and every single data point stays exactly the same. And you can move it to 9, so only changes only 1. So in fact, there's a nice natural break in the data right about there. That splits us up into 2 groups. All right, so that is the average of all 13 sets of rankings. And I'm colorblind, so I thought this was red. It turns out it's actually orange. Oops. Colored in orange are the unfiltered presidents. The presidents the theory codes as unfiltered. And, right, what you see, strikingly, is the visual is exactly kind of what I would like it to look like, right? The unfiltered people are disproportionately at the top and the bottom. 4 of the top 5 and 4 of the bottom 5 are unfiltered. I use a Monte Carlo simulation to test whether this was actually a statistically significant difference in variances. And what you find out is that it's statistically significant at the 99.97% level. Those of you who are social scientists know that this is not, to put it mildly, a very common social science number to see. And so you can imagine my excitement when I got this result. And there's a lot more math and tests underlying that of robustness that I'm happy to talk to people about if they're curious about that. Some of it's also in the appendix of the book. All right. So let's talk a little bit about cases. Right? Cases are where the meat is. I can test one hypothesis, variance, mathematically. But impact is counterfactual. Impact has to be done qualitatively. I have to step you through the history. So I'm going to do that quickly. Thomas Jefferson. If you remember that list of presidents by ranking, Thomas Jefferson is the 4th ranked president of the United States. If you know Thomas Jefferson's background, or you remember that the chart with the histories, you know that, in fact, Thomas Jefferson is one of the most thoroughly evaluated people ever to become president of the United States. He was a member of the Continental Congress, governor of Virginia, ambassador to France, Secretary of State, and Vice President of the United States before becoming President of the United States. A man of such extraordinary gifts that John F. Kennedy, when having dinner with American Nobel Prize winners, once declared, "This is the finest assemblage of talent ever grouped in the White House since Thomas Jefferson dined alone." So, if Jefferson is the 4th ranked president of the United States, you would think that he must have had a pretty big impact. So this poses a problem for my theory. How did someone so thoroughly evaluated end up so highly ranked? And what you'll see is that the answer is that the rankings are not impact. The rankings are a proxy for impact, but they're not exactly the same thing. Because remember our definition of impact, did things that other people would not have done. So I'm going to slide through most of the election of 1800, although I urge you to look it up because it is unbelievably entertaining and complex and confusing. And just to give you a sense is that the election featured the sitting president, John Adams, running against his own sitting vice president, Thomas Jefferson. One can only imagine what those cabinet meetings were like. And then in the election, Thomas Jefferson won, except he in fact tied. Only he didn't tie John Adams. There was a mistake in the drafting of the Constitution, and he tied his own vice president, Aaron Burr, who promptly tried to steal the presidency from him. This was all finally resolved after truly astonishingly baroque political maneuvering in the House of Representatives, with Thomas Jefferson becoming the president of the United States, largely on the theory that everybody in the United States acknowledged that he was the person who actually should have won the election. He was the person people were voting for, the person people thought they were getting, and everything else that happened was kind of just a fluke misfire. That we know they recognize this because the first thing the Congress did after Jefferson was inaugurated was amend the Constitution to make sure this could never happen again. So you have someone who is clearly the filtered modal candidate. This is the person who the system wants to be president of the United States. And in the process, what we can do is also identify the most likely alternatives, the people who were almost president. So the two we can identify are James Madison, who was Thomas Jefferson's Secretary of State, and who would go on to succeed Jefferson as President of the United States. And the reason we know Madison is is a likely alternative, in fact, the most likely alternative, is because Jefferson didn't want to run for president. Jefferson actually went to Madison and said, I really want you to run for president. And Madison, Jefferson's closest friend, said, no, I really don't think it should be me. I think it should be you this time. So all Madison had to do was say, yes, I will run, and Jefferson would not have been president. That makes him a pretty likely alternate. And the other likely alternate is John Adams. John Adams could conceivably have won that election, and John Adams is the predecessor to Thomas Jefferson. So these are the people we're baselining him against. So why is Thomas Jefferson the fourth-ranked president of the United States? Does anyone remember their history? What was the most important event of the Jefferson administration? Anybody? Yes, exactly that. The Louisiana Purchase. So if we want to know if Thomas Jefferson had an impact, well, the question we really need to ask is, does the Louisiana Purchase happen if someone other than Thomas Jefferson, in particular, if Madison or Adams had been president of the United States? So here's the thing. The way the purchase happens is Thomas Jefferson and James Madison get together and they decide that the United States of America must own the territory of New Orleans. Not Louisiana, just the city of New Orleans, which is the most important port in North America. In fact, as far as we can tell, there is not a single discussion by a single person in the entire United States about the possibility of buying the entire territory of Louisiana. So Jefferson then dispatches an emissary to France to negotiate with Napoleon about whether we could buy New Orleans. And before this man arrives in Paris, the French foreign minister goes to the American ambassador, already there at the time, and says, how would you guys like to buy all of Louisiana? Unsurprisingly, he says yes. So what I say is that you can tell this story a lot of ways, right? And then it comes back, and then there's some there's again, negotiations over whether the United States should actually ratify the treaty. And the greatest obstacle to the ratification of the treaty is Thomas Jefferson. Because Thomas Jefferson is a strict constructionist of the Constitution who believes that the federal government does not have the power to absorb territory. He's negotiating with Napoleon. Napoleon had overthrown his own government. As you can imagine, he was not enormously bound by constitutional restrictions. And so, at some point, he's actually started to withdraw the treaty. And Madison went to Jefferson, and maybe the only time in their careers that Jefferson's best friend confronted him so abruptly. And Madison said, this is too great an opportunity for you to squander it over constitutional issues. You need to step down and just stop blocking things, and we will go forward. Jefferson agrees. The purchase is made. So there are a lot of ways to tell this story, right? But there's no way to tell the story where if James Madison hadn't been president of the United States, it wouldn't have happened. Because the chronology does not allow it. Jefferson's guy is not in Paris yet when the decision is made. And we know that it would have happened, right? It took a lot of diplomatic skill. It took flexibility. It took resolve. It took lots of things to get the treaty through the Senate. But here's the thing. James Madison would have had those too. And the reason we know that is because he replaced Jefferson as president, and he did have those qualities when he was president of the United States. The other possibility is John Adams. Would Adams have supported the treaty? Well, we know because he went on record with a written letter saying that he would have. And we know that his son, John Quincy Adams, broke with his own party to support the treaty because he thought it was so important for the United States to gain the territory. And Quincy Adams would never have done that without consulting with his father. So, right, again, and would John Adams have had the same ability to get the treaty through the Senate? Well, yes, and we know he would have because he did when he was president of the United States. So at this point in time, what we can say is that the American system was working pretty well enough that everybody who got within sniffing distance of the presidency was someone who probably would have done the job pretty well, which is a great system, right? That's what you want. So in this story, what this highlights is the difference between impact and ranking, right? We should give Jefferson credit as a very, very successful president. He was. But that doesn't mean that other people in the same situation, given the same opportunities, would not also have been successful presidents. Difference between impact and success. Okay, flip side. Where am I on time, by the way? There's no... Okay, 5 more minutes, that's fine. Abraham Lincoln. Who here's seen the movie? The Lincoln movie? Absolutely fantastic, right? I hope you loved it. I thought this was great. So we have some of the characters here. So Abraham Lincoln it is almost impossible to overstate how obscure Abraham Lincoln was when he became president of the United States. The way I'll tell the story is this. Does everybody remember Barack Obama's 2004 convention speech in the Democratic Convention? If you were in the United States and are all interested in politics, you remember this speech, right? He basically set the building on fire. Like, by the time he was done, people were going, wow, that guy might be president of the United States one day. But it's easy to forget that when Barack Obama gave that speech, he wasn't running for president. He was running for Senate. And then he won his election for the Senate, and 4 years later, he ran for the presidency and he won. So Abraham Lincoln also became a national figure through a series of speeches. His debates with Stephen Douglas in Illinois, and maybe even more important, a speech he gave in the Cooper Union in New York a little while later. And in those speeches, he was also running for Senate. But Abraham Lincoln lost that Senate race. So the way to think about Abraham Lincoln in 1860, when he runs for president, is he's Barack Obama in 2008 if Barack Obama had lost his Senate race. Right? Would anybody have thought he was a plausible candidate for the presidency? I don't think so. I don't see how you could have. So Lincoln's nomination was extremely unlikely for a wide variety of reasons, which I won't go into for lack of time, but let me give you sort of what is both the strangest and perhaps most amusing one. The convention was set in Chicago. Lincoln was from Illinois. This gave Lincoln a home court advantage. The reason it was set in Chicago was because the Republican National Committee voted by one vote to put it in Illinois, and the grounds for that vote was that there were no significant Republicans from Illinois, so it would be neutral territory. Anybody here ever arranged a wedding where you agonized over the seating arrangements? Anybody? We got one in the back, okay. So this is the only case, as far as I'm aware, the only case in history where seating arrangements help to determine the future of a nation, because the convention was at absolute zoo because the Lincoln team did some small non-Lincolnian things like printing fake tickets to stuff the convention hall with Lincoln supporters who were recruited based on how loud their voices were and ordered that every time Lincoln's name was mentioned, they should yell and shout and scream, which they did so successfully the windows of the building rattled. And so this was a complete zoo, and then Lincoln's campaign manager, who knew that it would be total chaos, which no one else knew because no one else even knew Lincoln was a contender, then goes to the seating arrangements committee and arranges to have the New York delegation, which was the delegation supporting William Henry Seward, the man who should have been president of the United States. That's William Henry Seward, two-term governor of New York, two-term senator of New York, founding father of the Republican Party, the man by far most qualified to lead the United States through its moment of greatest crisis. And so he has the Seward delegation surrounded by other Seward-supporting delegations so that Seward's campaign manager is physically unable to work his way through the crowd during all the shouting and negotiate. And then Lincoln's campaign manager goes to Simon Cameron, the governor of Pennsylvania, a man of extraordinary corruption, and offers Cameron a cabinet seat in exchange for his vote for Lincoln. Cameron agrees, and Lincoln becomes the nomination. Just to give you a sense of how bad Cameron was, Cameron took the cabinet seat. When he was in the cabinet, Lincoln's own postmaster general, another member of the cabinet, said that Simon Cameron, and said this in public, Simon Cameron would steal anything except a red-hot stove. Simon Cameron objected to this and went to Lincoln, and Lincoln said, well, I guess I really can't have two members of my cabinet talking about each other like that. And so he went to the postmaster general and forced him to apologize, and he apologized. He said, I am sorry, you would also steal the stove. So that's how Abraham Lincoln became president of the United States. And again, there are lots of ways to tell this story, but there is no way to tell the story in which the United States decided that this was the person most qualified to do the job. It just didn't happen. So I'm not going to step you through Lincoln's impact as president because that is pointless. If you don't believe that Abraham Lincoln had an impact as president of the United States, I really don't know what to say to you. He did. If you're curious, I'm more than happy to talk about that in more detail later. But let me give you two things about choosing better leaders. Know when to gamble. Right? If you only take something away from this, know that picking a high-impact leader is inherently a risky proposition because it means picking someone who would do things that you wouldn't do. So that's dangerous. Innovation, desperation, and worlds of limited losses and unlimited gains. The classic example of that is scientific research. Second was, how do you improve your odds? Avoid false signals. Avoid things that make you think someone is more capable of doing the job than they actually are. Again, family, wealth, and connections are the classic example of that. Second is we often talk about we want the best leader. Let me urge you, and if you only take one thing away from this, that is the wrong language to use. Leadership is not a ranking problem, it is a matching problem. You want to match leaders to situations, not do a problem. The final one, and this is Abraham Lincoln, and other people I looked at. Another one in particular, a man named Judah Folkman, if some of you may know, an extraordinary cancer researcher, were both characterized by what I saw was a striking combination of both confidence and humility. So I'll leave you with Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address, the greatest speech ever given by an American, and one clause in it. With firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. Think about that clause for a second. This is the man who tossed, hundreds of thousands of young men into the fire in the Civil War in a war that he did not have to fight. All he had to do was say, no, the South can go, and the war would not have happened. It took extraordinary self-confidence for a man like that, for a man to do that, right? With firmness in the right. This is also a person who was willing to admit that he was wrong, and did over and over again, and took advice over and over again, and changed course when he had to over and over again. As God gives us to see the right. I think this is an acknowledgement of the limitations of his own wisdom and of the possibility that he might have been wrong. And so it's not that this was not a man of moderate qualities. It wasn't that he was sort of self-confident and sort of humble. It's that he was extraordinarily self-confident and extraordinarily humble. He pegged the scale on both dimensions, and it is that combination of profound opposites that I found differentiated the vast majority of even very successful leaders, who were really just people who happened to match the temper of the times and would have failed under other circumstances, from the very, very rare people who I think would have found a way to succeed if it was humanly possible to do so. And so let me leave you with those two qualities, and thank you very much for being a wonderful audience.
Thanks a lot. So let's do what we did last time. While the team is setting up the next talk, I invite the audience for one or two questions, depending on how time it is. The question actually I would have inside is, did you ever think whether this could be used in a predictive fashion?
So,
how would you do it with G or some other place? I'm sure you, as a business school person, you must think about it.
I do. So I think it absolutely can be used as a predictive fashion, right? That essentially every time a company brings in an outsider CEO, they're picking an unfiltered leader because they just don't know. Not only do they not know as much about this person, they don't know nearly as much about this person as they think they do.
And is there a cost-benefit analysis whether is it better to bring in an outside person because what you could gain is overweights what you could lose because they could be on both ends? Or?
Mm-hmm. So it depends on the situation you're in. GE should never bring in an outside person, right? They're pretty successful already. And it's much, much easier to destroy a company than it is to create a great one. One of the people I profile in the book is a man named Al Dunlap. Some of you may remember him. He was the CEO of a company called Sunbeam. All you really need to know about Al Dunlap's personality is that his nickname was Chainsaw Al, and he gave that nickname to himself. And he destroyed Sunbeam in 2 years. Took it from a very profitable, very successful 100-year-old company to zero in 2 years because he was a catastrophe. He was the worst CEO who's ever lived. And so, right, but if you are a scientific grant-making organization, your losses are limited, right? The worst case scenario is the grant is wasted, which, okay, I mean, a lot of grants are wasted. That's part of the deal. But your best case scenario is you give the money to Judah Folkman and he discovers angiogenesis or, something even more important. And so you should be much, much, much more willing to gamble. And so it's precisely, I think it's less about, on average, unfiltered leaders do worse than filtered ones. I think that's overwhelmingly true.
I like that conclusion, given that the science of success is not supported yet by any organization. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.